November 1944. Somewhere near the German border. Rainwater dripped from the canvas edges of an American field hospital as darkness settled. Across the muddy road outside, trucks moved slowly through the cold evening, their headlights dimmed beneath blackout covers. Far beyond the trees, artillery rolled like distant thunder. Inside one of the tents, the smell was unexpected. Turkey, coffee, warm bread. American cooks moved between folding tables, carrying metal trays, heavy with food flown across an ocean and hauled through a continent at war. Soldiers removed their gloves with stiff hands. Some had not seen home in years. Others had crossed France only weeks earlier, sleeping beside frozen roads and shattered villages. Near the entrance stood several German nurses captured during the retreat from Aachen, exhausted, silent, their gray uniforms still damp from the rain. For months, they had been told what Americans would do if Germany fell. But now they watched an American sergeant quietly place extra cups beside the coffee urn and gesture toward the tables. Outside, the war continued in darkness. Inside the tent, Thanksgiving dinner was about to begin. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its final and most destructive phase. Only months earlier, Allied troops had stormed the beaches of Normandy and broken through German defenses in northern France. Paris had been liberated in August. By September, American armored columns were already approaching the western borders of the Third Reich itself. For Germany, the advance felt impossible. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised that the war would never reach German soil. Newspapers spoke of miracle weapons and final victories. Radio broadcasts insisted that the Allies would eventually collapse from exhaustion. But across the country, ordinary civilians could already see the truth forming around them in smoke and rubble. Entire cities lay shattered beneath the Allied bombing campaign. Cologne, Hamburg, Kassel, and countless industrial centers burned under repeated air raids. Railway stations overflowed with refugees carrying blankets, children, and whatever possessions they could still move by hand. Fuel shortages crippled transportation. Food rationing tightened month after month. Hospitals were among the first systems to begin breaking apart. German military medicine had entered the war highly organized and technically advanced, but by late 1944, it was overwhelmed. Casualties from the Eastern Front continued pouring westward, while Allied offensives created new waves of wounded soldiers inside France and Belgium. Medical supplies vanished faster than factories could replace them. Morphine, bandages, antibiotics, and surgical equipment became increasingly scarce. Thousands of German nurses found themselves trapped inside a collapsing system that demanded constant sacrifice while offering almost no relief in return. Many served through organizations connected to the German Red Cross or military auxiliary services. Some had spent years moving between overcrowded field hospitals near the front lines. Others worked in temporary clinics created inside schools, churches, or railway buildings damaged by bombing. Most were young. Many had never traveled far from home before the war began. Now they worked beneath flickering lights and freezing temperatures, often treating wounded soldiers faster than beds could be emptied. At the same time, fear followed the Allied advance. German civilians and medical workers alike had been exposed for years to official warnings about what enemy troops would supposedly do once they entered Germany. American soldiers were often portrayed as violent occupiers driven by revenge. Stories, many exaggerated or entirely fabricated, spread rapidly through towns, already paralyzed by uncertainty. And as American forces moved closer to the Rhine, those fears traveled ahead of them into every hospital corridor and refugee column across Western Germany. For American soldiers, however, November carried a very different meaning. Even in wartime, the U.S. Army tried to preserve fragments of ordinary life whenever possible. Holidays mattered deeply to morale planners in the War Department because they reminded soldiers that somewhere beyond the mud, shellfire, and cold, another world still existed. A world of kitchens filled with light, radios playing music after dinner, families gathering around tables thousands of miles away. Thanksgiving held particular weight. Since the Civil War, the holiday had become tied to ideas of home, abundance, and national unity. During World War II, military newspapers regularly published Thanksgiving messages from President Franklin Roosevelt alongside photographs of troops eating holiday meals in distant places. Pacific Islands, English airfields, North African deserts. The reality at the front was rarely comfortable. Army cooks often prepared holiday dinners inside temporary field kitchens, assembled near active combat zones. Turkey arrived frozen in crates, shipped through massive Allied supply networks stretching from American factories to ports in Britain and France. Canned cranberries, powdered potatoes, coffee, cigarettes, and pies were distributed whenever transportation conditions allowed. Sometimes the meals happened only miles from artillery fire. American quartermaster units understood something essential about morale. Food carried emotional power beyond nutrition itself. A hot meal could briefly restore routine inside an environment built entirely around destruction. Soldiers who had spent weeks surviving on cold rations suddenly found themselves holding plates that reminded them of home. Letters written during the war frequently mentioned these moments. Men described carving turkey beside muddy roads, drinking coffee in bombed villages, listening to chaplains speak while snow collected outside canvas tents. Some units even improvised decorations using scrap paper or ration boxes. But in occupied areas and captured medical stations, these scenes produced another effect entirely. To many Germans, American abundance seemed unreal. Years of rationing had transformed everyday items into luxuries. Butter, sugar, coffee, chocolate, and meat had become increasingly rare inside Germany. By late 1944, civilians waited in long lines for bread while hospitals struggled to feed wounded patients adequately. Even medical staff often survived on thin soup and black bread during long shifts. Then came the Americans. Their trucks arrived carrying fuel, canned food, medical supplies, blankets, and equipment in quantities that appeared almost impossible to people watching. From ruined towns, alongside tanks and artillery, came field bakeries, mobile kitchens, refrigerated storage units, and entire logistical systems capable of feeding armies across continents. For German nurses who encountered American troops during those final months of war, the shock was not always caused by weapons or combat. Sometimes it began with coffee, sometimes with warm bread, and sometimes with an invitation to sit beside enemy soldiers during Thanksgiving dinner while the war still raged beyond the tent walls. By late 1944, many German nurses had stopped thinking in terms of victory. Their world had narrowed to exhaustion, overcrowded wards, and endless trains carrying wounded men westward from collapsing fronts. Some worked 16-hour shifts beneath weak electric lights powered by failing generators. Others slept in basements during air raids before returning upstairs to continue surgery beside shattered windows. Most had entered service believing they were helping defend their country. Many were trained under strict military discipline where emotional control was considered essential. Fear, grief, and doubt were rarely spoken aloud. But beneath the routine, anxiety spread steadily. As Allied forces crossed into German territory, nurses heard rumors constantly, stories of Soviet revenge in the East, tales of occupation in France and Belgium. Propaganda broadcasts warned that Germany's enemies would bring humiliation and destruction once the borders collapsed. For younger nurses especially, uncertainty became its own form of terror. Some destroyed personal documents before evacuations. Others hid family photographs or removed insignia from their uniforms. In overcrowded hospitals near Aachen and the Rhineland, many prepared mentally for captivity long before it officially arrived. Then came encounters that contradicted nearly everything they had been told. American medics treating German wounded beside Allied casualties, guards speaking calmly instead of violently, soldiers sharing cigarettes or helping carry stretchers through the mud. The shock was not dramatic at first. It was quiet, and that quiet uncertainty began weakening years of certainty built by war. For American soldiers advancing through Western Europe, Thanksgiving in 1944 felt impossibly far from home. Many had landed in France only months earlier during the Normandy campaign. Since then, they had crossed rivers under fire, slept beside hedgerows, and buried friends in temporary graves marked by wooden crosses. Rain-soaked uniforms for days at a time. Cold weather settled into boots and gloves before winter had even fully arrived. Most infantrymen were barely in their 20s. Factory workers from Ohio, farm boys from Kansas, Students from New York who had traded classrooms for rifles almost overnight. Around campfires and inside transport trucks, conversations often returned to familiar memories. Mothers cooking holiday meals, crowded dining rooms, football games on the radio, warm houses untouched by war. Thanksgiving became a psychological anchor. Army kitchens tried to recreate the holiday whenever conditions allowed because commanders understood morale could collapse as quickly as supply lines. A proper meal reminded soldiers why they were fighting and what kind of world they hoped still existed after the war ended. Yet many Americans entering Germany also carried anger. They had seen concentration camps, destroyed villages, and civilians displaced across Europe. Some had fought through brutal resistance in Normandy, or lost close friends during the advance toward the Rhine. Compassion did not erase those memories, which made certain moments even more remarkable. Despite the violence surrounding them, countless American units continued following strict rules regarding prisoners, civilians, and medical personnel. In field hospitals especially, enemy nurses often discovered that the young men they feared most behaved less like conquerors and more like exhausted human beings trying to survive. Another winter far from home, and during Thanksgiving, that humanity became unusually visible. For years, Nazi propaganda had built a carefully controlled image of the Allies. American soldiers were often portrayed as undisciplined, materialistic, and morally weak. Official films and newspapers insisted that Germany faced enemies who lacked culture, honor, or restraint. As the war turned against the Reich, propaganda became even darker, warning civilians that occupation would bring chaos and revenge. These messages intensified after Allied bombing campaigns devastated German cities. By 1944, fear had become a political weapon. Civilians were encouraged to believe that surrender meant national annihilation. Medical workers, government employees, and refugee families carried these fears with them as the front moved steadily closer. But propaganda had one weakness. Reality eventually arrives. When American troops occupied towns in Western Germany, many civilians encountered something unexpected: organization instead of uncontrolled violence. Military police enforcing discipline, engineers restoring bridges and roads, medics treating wounded prisoners, field kitchens distributing food not only to soldiers, but sometimes to civilians trapped inside combat zones. This did not erase the brutality of war itself. Combat remained violent and destructive until the final days of the conflict. Yet individual encounters often contradicted years of official messaging. German nurses noticed details first: the way American doctors consulted them during medical procedures, the willingness of some soldiers to exchange cigarettes for information about wounded patients, the strange normality of hearing jazz music playing softly from military radios while artillery echoed in the distance. Small moments accumulated quietly: a cup of coffee offered without hostility, a blanket handed to a prisoner, an invitation to eat, and inside exhausted hospitals filled with wounded men from both sides. Those moments carried enormous psychological weight. In the final year of the war, food became one of the clearest symbols of national strength. Germany's economy had been stretched beyond its limits by years of total war. Allied bombing campaigns destroyed rail hubs, fuel depots, factories, and storage centers faster than they could be rebuilt. Transportation networks broke apart under constant attack from the air. Coal shortages reduced industrial output. Refrigerated transport became increasingly unreliable. The effects reached civilians and hospitals alike. Bread was stretched with fillers. Meat nearly vanished from many urban diets. Coffee was replaced with substitutes made from roasted barley or chicory roots. In overcrowded medical stations, nurses often watched wounded soldiers recover slowly because proper nutrition no longer existed. The United States represented the opposite reality. American industry operated on a scale almost unimaginable. To exhausted Germans by 1944, massive cargo convoys crossed the Atlantic, continuously carrying canned meat, powdered milk, flour, sugar, medical supplies, cigarettes, and fuel. Behind every advancing American division stood an enormous logistical system capable of feeding millions of men simultaneously across multiple continents. To German civilians, this abundance sometimes appeared more shocking than tanks. American troops handed out chocolate bars to children. Coffee was brewed in quantities large enough for entire units. Thanksgiving dinners included turkey, potatoes, bread, canned fruit, and desserts, while nearby towns struggled to provide basic meals. For German nurses accustomed to rationing and scarcity, these scenes carried emotional impact beyond hunger itself. The war had taught them to expect collapse. Instead, they encountered an army that could still celebrate. Field hospitals occupied a strange space during World War II. Even at the height of combat, medical staff on all sides often operated according to professional codes that survived beyond ideology. Doctors and nurses understood suffering in practical terms: blood loss, infection, shock, exhaustion. Wounded bodies rarely cared about politics. American medical units moving through Western Europe frequently treated German prisoners alongside Allied casualties, especially during fast-moving offensives where evacuation routes overlapped. Captured medics and nurses were sometimes temporarily retained to help manage overcrowded wards because experienced personnel were desperately needed everywhere. Inside these hospitals, enemy lines blurred unexpectedly. German nurses who expected immediate imprisonment occasionally found themselves assisting American surgeons during emergency procedures. Language barriers were overcome with gestures, improvised translation, and medical terminology understood across national boundaries. There were tensions, of course. Many American soldiers carried deep resentment after years of war. Some German staff remained loyal to the regime until the very end. Yet hospitals demanded cooperation because wounded men continued arriving, regardless of politics. Historical accounts from both Allied and German personnel describe moments of uneasy professionalism slowly turning into cautious respect. An American medic sharing cigarettes during a night shift, a German nurse helping stabilize an Allied casualty. Coffee passed between former enemies while artillery sounded outside. These were not grand acts of reconciliation. They were practical human responses inside an environment saturated with death. And sometimes those small moments affected people more deeply than battles themselves. Thanksgiving carried a meaning that extended far beyond food. For American troops overseas, the holiday represented continuity, proof that ordinary traditions could survive. Even in the middle of global war, chaplains held short services inside damaged churches or muddy camps. Soldiers wrote letters describing meals that barely resembled home, yet still mattered deeply because they preserved ritual. But to Germans witnessing these celebrations, the experience often felt surreal. Europe, in late 1944, existed beneath constant pressure. Collapsing governments, refugee movement, bombed cities, and approaching armies. Entire communities lived with uncertainty about whether they would survive the winter. Then came scenes almost impossible to reconcile with wartime expectations. American soldiers decorating mess tents, music playing softly from military radios, turkeys roasting near frontline positions, young men laughing briefly before returning to combat duties. For German nurses standing inside captured hospitals or temporary camps, Thanksgiving revealed something larger about the United States itself. Not simply military strength, but confidence. An army secure enough in its supply system and disciplined to preserve tradition while advancing through enemy territory. The emotional shock came from contrast. One side of the war was collapsing into scarcity and fear. The other still carried fragments of home across oceans. And when American soldiers invited exhausted enemy nurses to share coffee or bread during those holiday meals, the gesture became unforgettable, precisely because it arrived in the middle of destruction rather than after it. Outside the tents, artillery still echoed across Europe, but inside, another kind of reality had quietly begun replacing the old one. November 23, 1944, Thanksgiving Day. The front line stretched across a cold and broken landscape near the German border. Rain had turned roads into deep channels of mud where supply trucks struggled forward hour after hour. American artillery batteries continued firing through the morning while engineers repaired bridges damaged during the retreating German withdrawal. Near Aachen, inside a temporary medical station assembled from canvas, tents, and partially ruined farm buildings, exhaustion hung over everything. The hospital had changed hands only days earlier. German wounded still occupied several rows of beds alongside newly arrived American casualties brought in from nearby fighting. The air smelled of antiseptic, wet wool, smoke, and diesel fuel drifting in from the vehicle yard outside. Nurses moved carefully between stretchers, beneath dim electric lamps, powered by portable generators that rattled constantly against the cold. By afternoon, rumors spread quietly through the camp. The Americans were preparing a Thanksgiving meal. For many German nurses, the idea seemed absurd. Combat continued only miles away. Ambulances still arrived carrying wounded men from the front. Outside, shattered trees and abandoned equipment lined the roads leading east toward the Rhine. Yet, near the center of the compound, army cooks had already begun unloading supplies. Metal containers filled with potatoes, bread wrapped in canvas coverings, crates stamped with American markings, large steel coffee urns releasing steam into the freezing air. Several German nurses watched silently from near the entrance of the medical tent. Most had not eaten a proper meal in weeks. During the retreat across western Germany, food deliveries had become irregular and unpredictable. Hospitals survived on whatever local authorities could still provide: thin soup, black bread, occasional canned vegetables. Coffee had almost disappeared entirely. Now the smell drifting across the muddy yard felt almost unreal. Turkey roasting inside a field kitchen. Fresh coffee, warm bread. An American sergeant noticed them standing there. For a brief moment, nobody moved. The nurses expected orders, interrogation, perhaps removal to another camp. Instead, the sergeant simply pointed toward a nearby table, where extra tin cups had been arranged, beside the coffee containers. One of the younger nurses hesitated before stepping forward. Around her, American soldiers sat heavily onto benches after long shifts, transporting wounded men. Some removed helmets, still wet from rain. Others unfolded letters from home before beginning their meal. A chaplain spoke briefly near the center table, his voice almost lost beneath the distant sound of artillery. Then food was passed across the room. No speeches, no celebration of victory. Only tired men sharing what little sense of normal life they could still preserve inside a continent collapsing around them. The silence from the German side remained unmistakable. Several nurses later recalled being stunned less by the food itself than by the atmosphere surrounding it. The Americans behaved casually, calmly. Some even attempted awkward conversation through broken German phrases and hand gestures. One nurse reportedly stared at the coffee cup in her hands for several seconds before drinking, as though trying to understand whether the moment was actually real. Outside the hospital perimeter, the war continued without pause. But inside the mess tent, years of propaganda had begun quietly unraveling beneath the glow of hanging lanterns and the smell of Thanksgiving dinner. Only weeks after that Thanksgiving, the Western Front exploded into one of the war's final violent convulsions. In December 1944, German forces launched the Ardennes Offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, in a desperate attempt to split Allied lines and slow the advance toward the Rhine. Snow buried roads across Belgium and Luxembourg. Fuel shortages crippled German armored units almost immediately. Yet the fighting remained savage. Field hospitals overflowed again. American surgeons operated for hours without rest while evacuation trucks struggled through forests, clogged with ice and wreckage. German medical personnel captured during the offensive were often redirected into emergency treatment centers simply because experienced hands were urgently needed. In many places, enemy nurses and medics worked side by side beneath conditions that erased nearly every illusion left about the war. By early 1945, Germany's collapse could no longer be hidden. Entire civilian columns moved westward ahead of the Soviet advance in the east. Rail systems barely functioned. Cities along the Rhine burned beneath constant bombing raids while military authorities tried unsuccessfully to organize new defensive lines from exhausted teenagers, wounded veterans, and fragmented reserve units. Inside hospitals, the emotional atmosphere changed completely. The language of victory disappeared first, then certainty. German nurses who had once believed they were serving a powerful modern state now watched that state disintegrate, room by room around them. Supplies vanished. Communications failed. Senior officials fled ahead of advancing armies. More and more wounded soldiers arrived not with determination, but with resignation. And still the Americans kept coming, not only with tanks and artillery, but with trucks carrying fuel, medicine, blankets, food, and engineering equipment in quantities difficult for exhausted German civilians to comprehend. Temporary feeding stations appeared in occupied towns. Medical units organized treatment areas with industrial efficiency. Army kitchens continued serving hot meals even while combat operations pushed deeper into Germany. For many witnesses, this contrast became unforgettable. One side of Europe was collapsing into hunger and displacement. The other possessed enough stability to maintain routine, enough food for holiday dinners, enough coffee to pour extra cups for prisoners and enemy nurses. During the spring of 1945, surrender spread gradually across Western Germany. White flags appeared from windows and church towers. Military convoys abandoned vehicles beside roads emptied of fuel. In countless hospitals and refugee centers, the emotional tension that had defined years of propaganda suddenly dissolved into uncertainty about what would happen next. Some German nurses later described feeling relief mixed with humiliation. Others simply felt tired. But among many accounts recorded after the war, one detail appeared repeatedly: surprise at the behavior of ordinary American soldiers during occupation. Not because the war itself had been gentle, it had not, but because daily interactions often contradicted the fear they had carried for years. The memory of Thanksgiving dinners, shared coffee, cigarettes exchanged during night shifts, and quiet conversations inside overcrowded medical tents remained vivid precisely because those moments happened while the war was still alive around them, not after peace, not after treaties, during the collapse itself. And in that narrow space between enemy and caretaker, between occupier and exhausted civilian, another reality had emerged, one shaped less by ideology than by ordinary human gestures carried out beneath the shadow of one of history's largest wars. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. Across Europe, church bells rang through ruined cities while soldiers fired signal flares into the night sky. In London, Paris, and New York, crowds flooded streets, celebrating the end of nearly 6 years of war on the continent. Inside Germany itself, the mood was very different. Large sections of the country no longer functioned as a modern state. Transportation systems had collapsed. Millions of refugees moved across damaged roads, searching for missing relatives, food, or shelter. Entire urban districts remained fields of broken brick and twisted steel. In some cities, water and electricity worked only intermittently for months after the surrender. Hospitals faced enormous pressure. Years of bombing and combat had destroyed medical infrastructure. Across much of the country, many facilities lacked heat, medicine, clean bedding, or reliable sanitation. Diseases spread rapidly among displaced civilians crowded into temporary shelters and railway stations. German nurses who survived the war often remained at their posts simply because there was nobody else available. The Allied occupation authorities quickly recognized that rebuilding public health systems would become essential for stabilizing Germany. American military governments reopened hospitals, organized vaccination campaigns, repaired utilities, and distributed emergency food supplies through both military and civilian channels. Food remained the most immediate crisis. By the summer of 1945, ration levels in many regions had fallen dangerously low. Agricultural production had collapsed during the final battles, and transportation failures prevented efficient distribution. Even where supplies existed, malnutrition became widespread among civilians, especially children and the elderly. Against this background, memories of American field kitchens and wartime food distribution became deeply significant to many Germans. For civilians who had endured years of scarcity, the scale of Allied supply operations appeared overwhelming. Army trucks delivered flour, canned goods, powdered milk, and medical supplies into regions where local systems had nearly ceased functioning altogether. American soldiers were still occupiers, but they were also increasingly associated with stability, order, and access to food. For German nurses, the contrast between expectation and reality continued shaping post-war memory. Many had entered 1945 believing occupation would bring uncontrolled violence and revenge. Instead, they often found themselves working directly with Allied medical personnel trying to prevent famine and disease inside devastated communities. This did not erase bitterness or trauma from the war. Germany's collapse had come at catastrophic human cost. Millions were dead across Europe. Entire families had disappeared into battlefields, bombing raids, prison camps, or concentration camps whose horrors were only beginning to emerge fully into public view. Yet, amid the destruction, smaller memories endured. Warm coffee handed across a medical table, American medics sharing cigarettes during overnight shifts, Thanksgiving meals served inside canvas tents, while artillery still echoed beyond the horizon. And those memories remained, powerful because they represented something unexpected at the exact moment when the world around them seemed to be ending. In the decades after the war, many German civilians and medical workers spoke about the final months of 1944 and 1945 with a strange mixture of shame, grief, and disbelief. The collapse of the Third Reich forced millions of people to reevaluate everything they had been taught for years. Propaganda that once seemed unquestionable suddenly appeared fragile when compared against lived experience. For German nurses especially, memories of direct contact with American troops often stood in sharp contrast to the fear that had dominated wartime, broadcasts, and official warnings. Some later described their surprise in very ordinary terms: the politeness of American guards, the abundance of food, the calm discipline inside military hospitals. Others remembered details so small they might have disappeared entirely under different circumstances. The taste of real coffee after years without it, white bread served warm inside a freezing tent, canned fruit shared during overnight medical shifts. Those memories mattered because war had reduced daily life to survival. A single hot meal could become unforgettable. Historians studying the occupation years have often noted that the United States projected power during World War II, not only through weapons but through logistics and industrial capacity. American forces crossed oceans carrying enormous quantities of fuel, machinery, medicine, and food to populations devastated by years of scarcity. That material abundance became psychologically influential in ways difficult to measure fully. Thanksgiving carried special symbolism within those encounters. To Americans, it remained a reminder of home and continuity. To many Germans witnessing it for the first time, the holiday represented something entirely different: stability in the middle of collapse, an army confident enough to preserve ritual while fighting across foreign territory. That image lingered long after the war ended, not because Thanksgiving itself changed history, but because moments surrounding it revealed how rapidly enemies could become something more complicated once ideology weakened. Inside hospitals and refugee centers, nurses who once expected brutality encountered exhausted young soldiers missing their families thousands of miles away. The contrast stayed with them. Many post-war accounts from Western Germany describe a gradual realization that ordinary American servicemen often behaved less like the monsters of propaganda and more like human beings trapped inside the same catastrophe consuming Europe. None of this erased the destruction of the war itself. Cities remained in ruins. Families mourned their dead for decades. The moral devastation left by Nazi crimes could never be softened by isolated moments of kindness. Yet history is often remembered through human experiences, rather than official documents alone. And for some German nurses who survived those final months, one of the clearest memories was not the sound of artillery or collapsing governments. It was the moment enemy soldiers quietly made room at a Thanksgiving table while the war still burned outside. Wars are often remembered through maps, offensives, and surrender documents. But for the people trapped inside them, memory usually survives in smaller fragments: a railway station filled with refugees, boots drying beside a hospital stove, coffee steaming beneath canvas tents, while distant artillery rolls across the horizon. In the final months of World War II, Germany collapsed under the weight of destruction it could no longer control. Entire cities disappeared into rubble. Millions of lives were shattered across a continent, exhausted by violence. Yet, even within that collapse, ordinary human encounters continued shaping how people understood the enemy standing in front of them. For American soldiers, Thanksgiving represented a brief connection to home, a ritual carried across oceans into the middle of war. For German nurses, those same meals sometimes revealed something unexpected: that the young men advancing through their country were not the faceless monsters described by years of propaganda, but tired soldiers trying to preserve pieces of normal life while history unraveled around them. The war did not end because of shared meals. It ended through surrender, exhaustion, and overwhelming military force. But moments of humanity mattered because they survived after the gunfire faded. Long after the tents were dismantled and the front lines vanished from Europe, some witnesses still remembered the smell of warm bread, the sound of quiet conversation in broken German and English, and the strange silence that filled a field hospital when enemy soldiers shared Thanksgiving dinner in the middle of history's largest war.